In the summer of 2007, Bear Stearns' risk management function was producing regular reports on the firm's exposure to the mortgage market. The reports were accurate within the parameters they measured. The parameters they measured were the ones the risk management framework had been designed to measure. The risk that was accumulating, specifically the correlation risk that would make the hedges fail simultaneously during a market stress event, was not a parameter the risk management framework had been designed to measure. The risk nobody was monitoring was not being ignored. It was categorized. It had been assigned to the managed risks column rather than the monitored risks column, and the assignment had been made at a moment when the conditions that would make the categorization wrong had not yet arrived. By the time those conditions arrived, the monitoring function had been removed from the risk. It had been classified as managed, and managed risks don't require ongoing monitoring in the same way that unmanaged risks do. This is the specific mechanism by which unmonitored risk accumulates, not through negligence, but through the specific organizational process by which risks are identified, assessed, categorized, and then assigned to the appropriate treatment, and through the way that treatment assignment removes the risk from the active monitoring agenda. A managed risk is a risk that has been addressed. A categorized risk is a risk that has been acknowledged. An unmonitored risk is a risk that has been addressed or acknowledged in conditions that no longer apply, and that has therefore accumulated past the level the original treatment was designed to contain, while the monitoring function that would have detected the accumulation was removed along with the active concern. The Shoreham Nuclear Power Plant on Long Island was constructed between 1973 and 1984 at a cost that escalated from an original estimate of $75 million to a final cost of approximately $6 billion. The plant was completed in 1984. It never produced a single kilowatt-hour of commercial electricity. The reason it never operated was not a failure of the plant itself. The engineering reviews found it to be operational. The reason was an evacuation plan that the plant's operator, Long Island Lighting Company, could not get approved by the state and county governments responsible for signing off on emergency procedures. The evacuation risk, the question of how to safely evacuate Long Island's densely populated geography in the event of a nuclear emergency, had been categorized during the construction period as a solvable problem that would be addressed before the plant opened. The risk that nobody was monitoring during the years of construction was whether the evacuation plan would actually achieve regulatory approval. The plan was treated as a future problem that would be solved by the time it became relevant, which is the most common form of unmonitored risk in large projects. The condition that must be met before the project delivers its value, categorized as to be resolved and removed from the active monitoring agenda. $6 billion was spent. The plant was completed. The condition that had been categorized as to be resolved turned out to be unresolvable in the specific regulatory environment that had developed during the construction period. The risk that nobody was monitoring while the money was being spent was the regulatory viability of the evacuation plan, a risk that, if it had been monitored, would have been visible as accumulating impossibility well before the plant was complete. Have you ever been part of a project where a condition required for the project's success was categorized as to be resolved and received no ongoing monitoring, and where the failure to monitor it turned out to be the specific thing that determined the outcome? Leave a comment. The specific pattern that unmonitored risk follows has a consistent structure across the cases where it is most consequential. The risk is identified during the planning phase. It receives an initial assessment. The assessment concludes that the risk is manageable, which is true at the time the assessment is conducted. The risk is assigned a treatment, a hedge, a contingency, a mitigation plan. The treatment is implemented. The risk is categorized as managed and removed from the active monitoring agenda. Conditions change. The conditions under which the risk was assessed as manageable are replaced by conditions under which the original treatment is insufficient. The accumulation of the changed conditions is not visible in the monitoring framework because the monitoring framework was designed to detect the risks that are being monitored, and this risk has been categorized as managed and removed from active monitoring. At some point, the accumulated exposure becomes large enough that its consequences are visible even without a monitoring framework, because the consequences are now visible in outcomes rather than in the risk indicators that would have been visible earlier. At this point, the risk is no longer unmonitored, it is urgent. Bear Stearns' correlation risk followed this pattern exactly. The risk that the hedges would fail in a correlated stress event had been identified. It had been assessed as manageable given the historical correlation data. It had been treated through specific hedge positions that were designed to perform in the scenarios the models covered. It had been removed from the active monitoring agenda because it was managed. The conditions changed. The historical correlation data that the models were calibrated on didn't include the specific kind of global flight to quality that the Russia default and contagion scenario produced. The hedges failed. The correlation risk, which had been managed on the basis of historical data that turned out not to cover this scenario, produced losses that exceeded the firm's capital. If the specific mechanism, categorization as managed, removes a risk from monitoring precisely when the conditions that made it manageable are most likely to be changing, is what makes this channel worth your time. The like is the direct signal. The human dimension of unmonitored risk is the dimension that is most consistently absent from the financial analysis of risk management failures. The risk managers at Bear Stearns who had categorized the correlation risk as managed were not negligent. They had performed the analysis that their framework specified. They had implemented the treatments that the framework recommended. They had moved the risk into the appropriate column in the risk register. They had done their jobs correctly. The framework itself was the problem. Specifically, the framework's implicit assumption that a risk categorized as managed at one point in time remains managed as conditions change, without requiring ongoing monitoring to verify that the categorization still applies. The 14,000 Bear Stearns employees who lost their jobs when J.P. Morgan acquired the firm for $10 per share in March 2008 had not designed the risk management framework. They had worked in a firm whose risk management practices had been accepted as industry standard, whose categorization of the correlation risk as managed had seemed reasonable at the time, and whose capital was insufficient to absorb the consequences of that categorization failing. The people who bore the weight of the risk management failure were not the people who had made the risk management decisions. The people who made the risk management decisions had the most ability to access the information that would have changed the decisions and the least incentive to build a framework that would surface discomforting information about their own assessments. The practical response to the unmonitored risk problem is a specific modification to the standard risk management framework. Every risk that has been categorized as managed must have an explicit trigger, a specific observable condition, whose change would require the risk to be recategorized and actively monitored. The trigger is not the conditions change. That is too vague to operationalize. The trigger is specific. If the correlation between instrument A and instrument B exceeds threshold during a defined stress scenario, the correlation risk treatment must be re-evaluated. The specificity of the trigger, the concrete observable condition rather than the vague, if things change, is what makes it possible to actually monitor for the trigger rather than to simply intend to notice if things change. For the Long Island Lighting Company's evacuation plan, the trigger would have been: if the state or county regulatory bodies raise objections to specific elements of the evacuation plan that cannot be resolved through the existing approval process, the regulatory viability risk must be escalated and the project's continuation must be reassessed. The trigger is observable. The escalation process is defined. The recategorization is explicit. Most risk management frameworks do not include this element. The risks that are managed are removed from active monitoring without a defined trigger for recategorization. The conditions change. The managed risk accumulates. The consequences arrive before the monitoring does. The next episode looks at the second-order effects that are visible before they're called that, the early signals of consequences that haven't yet arrived but that are already underway. This content was developed with the support of artificial intelligence tools and underwent human review, editorial curation, and approval before publication. The analysis presented here is strictly educational and philosophical in nature, grounded in behavioral psychology and classical stoicism.